Always Gardenia, Chapter 1. Maybe that's Arnold Wiggins, Gardenia Pitkin thought, as the man a few yards ahead of her on the path unsnapped the leash on a copper-colored dachshund. Checking over his shoulder first, he stooped down to harvest a jonquil from the bed where it stood sentry, with dozens of others in the pale March in Seattle sunshine. The man slipped the jonquil into one pocket of his navy windbreaker. From the other, he pulled what looked to be tea bags, as if checking to make sure he had provisioned himself, and then slipped them back in again. No one else was treading through the campus of the University of the Northwest at 8:30 in the morning, so it was likely that the dachshund lover and flower plucker was Dr. Arnold Wiggins. As acting chair of the Department of English, he would make the final decision on hiring Gardenia as the administrative assistant for the department. He could be from central casting for English professors, Gardenia thought, with his baggy khakis and rumpled curly hair and soft-soled Oxfords. Even the dachshund, trotting along tetherless and veering from the path with his nose to the ground, was an appropriately eccentric accessory. I will tell him right away that we share a fondness for dachshunds, Gardenia thought, though my Susie is of miniature lineage and his fellow a noble standard. With a crisp whistle, Must be Dr. Wiggins beckoned the dog and snapped on the leash before unlocking the door to the Arts and Sciences building. "Excuse me," Gardenia called as she hurried to the entrance. "I'm Gardenia Pitkin." Hearing her name hang in the morning quiet, Gardenia felt her cheeks flush. Well, what if this isn't Arnold Wiggins? What if this is someone who has no reason to know my name at all, a denizen of the philosophy department, or a visiting Bulgarian historian, or even a custodian? But the man turned and smiled. "Ah, a timely arrival indeed. I forgot to mention in my email that the building would be locked because of spring break." He extended his hand. "Arnold Wiggins, acting chair, taking over for Dr. Gludger. Thank you for agreeing to meet me at this early hour." "No problem. And this is?" Gardenia knelt and offered her fist for the dachshund to sniff. "Leroy, well behaved enough to be my office mate. Dog dander is never a problem. Dachshunds are well known for their hypoallergenic qualities." "Oh, I know," Gardenia said. "I have a dachshund too, though she's a cross between a long-haired and a wire-haired. Scruffy and smaller, but still a dachshund." Arnold Wiggins smiled, showing slightly prominent teeth. "We already have something in common. We'll take the stairs if you don't mind. We're on the second floor." He picked Leroy up, carefully supporting the dog's hindquarters and thus certifying him as one who knew the fragility of the low-rider back. Gardenia had hoped to have a chance to dodge into the restroom to brush her hair and regloss her lips before her appointment, but she sensed that Dr. Wiggins would not notice nor care about such last-minute primping. He unlocked one of the wide French doors leading to the English department. From one of the back offices came the drone of a female voice. "Ah, it must be our esteemed poetry professor, Frida Ham, one of the few who can't refrain from working even during spring break. Hello, Wiggins here," he called. When there was no response, he whispered to Gardenia, "Indeed, the mesmerizing qualities of John Donne. May I ask you to wait a moment while I get the good fellow settled?" "Of course." Gardenia sat in a chair near what appeared to be the desk for the administrative assistant and with a clear view of Arnold Wiggins' office. She watched as he coaxed the purloined jonquil into a thin-necked white vase on his office windowsill and filled Leroy's food bowl from a bag of kibble in the bottom drawer of the file cabinet. Gardenia had not noticed whether he wore a wedding ring, but she would put money on the notion that he was a childless bachelor, though why she concluded such a thing she wasn't sure. Maybe it was the way he treated Leroy, as if a child substitute, or perhaps his styleless jacket and trousers. A good wife would have insisted that he put on nicer things for a first meeting with a potential employee. "I used to give Tory editorial comments on his clothes," Gardenia recalled, on days when he was lost in his math teacher concerns and didn't realize that he had a dab of teriyaki sauce on his shirt, or that he'd worn the same cords 4 days in a row. The droning had stopped. A small, sturdy pony of a woman in jeans and a brown sweatshirt emerged from one of the back offices, leading a taller, younger woman who seemed to be the exact opposite appearance-wise, with her straight planks of white blonde hair, trim red jacket, and long legs in slender black trousers. "Where's Dr. Wiggins?" the sturdy pony asked. "We've been waiting for him." "In his office." Gardenia stood up and extended her hand. "I'm Gardenia Pitkin. I'm interviewing for the administrative assistant job." "Frida Ham. I teach poetry, or should I say about poetry and poets. None of those workshops like the others do." Her adamant tone indicated that this was something she was either proud of or expected she would have to defend. "And I am Laurel Dubar." The blonde shook Gardenia's hand. "Dr. Dubar," Frida said. "She's the new postmodern adjunct for just this quarter. Where's Arn?" He stepped out of his office. "Arnold Wiggins, Chaucer specialist and acting chair." With a quick bow, he offered his hand, which Dr. Dubar shook with authority. "I thought you said 8:15, or maybe I entered it in my calendar wrong. The door to the building was locked, but fortunately Frida had just arrived and let me in." Dr. Dubar pulled on a silver hoop earring. Oh, my apologies," Dr. Wiggins said. "I told her to look around while I did my early morning reciting," Frida said. "Excuse me, but some of us don't take much of a vacation. I have to get back to my lesson plans." "Thanks for letting me in," Dr. Dubar said, and Frida called, "No worries," as she hurried back to her office. "We're lucky to have you on short notice," Arnold said, "what with Dr. Gledger suddenly deciding to retire after his heart attack scare." He jammed his hands into the pockets of his khakis. "I hope you have had enough time to prepare for your classes." At this, Dr. Dubar tossed her hair and fiddled again with the silver hoop. "I have had almost no time to prepare." "Oh, indeed, my apologies." Dr. Wiggins raked his tangle of graying auburn curls. "For the second time in about half a minute, you've apologized to her, and now you're even blushing," Gardenia thought. "And she is the new hire who should be deferential to you." "Never mind," Dr. Dubar said. "I'd like to see my office." Oh, indeed, right away." Dr. Wiggins turned to Gardenia. "Would you like to join us? A tour of the premises?" Oh, sure," Gardenia said. Leading Dr. Dubar down the hall, Dr. Wiggins patted the windbreaker pocket that held the tea bags. This sleek young lady wouldn't appreciate a mug of tea, Gardenia thought. More the espresso macchiato type. "This is the office of Dr. Gledger, now happily living in, we hope, a heart-healthy retirement on Lopez Island," Dr. Wiggins said as he opened a door at the far end of the hallway. "One of the few offices with 2 sets of windows." Dr. Dubar strode into Dr. Gledger's office with its lonely landscape of empty bookcases and denuded desktop and strode right out again. "He smoked, didn't he?" Dr. Gledger did go outside to the service entrance to have a cigarette, but the entire building is smoke-free," Dr. Wiggins said. "It doesn't matter. It comes in on their clothes. Can't you smell it?" It's not too bad," Gardenia said, even though she had noticed the odor as soon as Dr. Wiggins had opened the door. "No one told me I would have an office that smells of cigarette smoke. Is there another one I could use?" Dr. Dubar said. Unfortunately, the inn is full, you might say," Dr. Wiggins said. At this, Dr. Dubar plunked her leather satchel on the desk and knelt down to sniff the carpet. "The stink has soaked into the carpet. Can you arrange to have it replaced?" Replaced? As I recall, there is a facilities budget. I can investigate the available sums." From his non-teabag holding windbreaker pocket, Dr. Wiggins dug out a small notebook and stub of pencil and scribbled something with a flourish. "I'll discuss this with Hamilton Dodge, the Dean of Arts and Sciences. I believe you met him when you interviewed?" Dr. Dubar stood up and adjusted the waistband of her slacks, not replying to the question. I hate to be a complainer on my first day. About time you realized how demanding you're being, Gardenia thought. But it makes no sense to set up my office until that odor is gone. I'll go home and work there today, Dr. Wigham. Wiggins? He peeped. But do call me Arnold. Oops. Okay, Arn. Thanks for your trouble. A miasma of flowery scent wafted around Dr. Dubar as she passed Gardenia on the way to the door. Not appropriate for an academic setting, but does explain why she's so touchy about the smell of an office carpet, Gardenia thought. We're lucky to have Dr. Dubar, an instructor of such stellar credentials, Dr. Wiggins said to Gardenia. But now, about your position, I can't say it's the most scintillating work in the world, but we generally don't bother the secretary, I mean the administrative assistant, too much. The odd copying job, maybe a letter of recommendation, students coming in with drop-in ad forms, and the ones who are in tears over an A- and want to know if they can get a grade change. I have a son a few years older than these students, Gardenia said, so I know the age group and quite like it, and the office is pleasant. As far as I'm concerned, the final interview is hereby finished. You are duly employed. Dr. Wiggins shook her hand and pulled the tea bags from his pocket. May I offer you a cup of kimun? Oh, yes, please. Sugar? Milk? Milk, please. Arnold loped down the hall to the department's kitchenette, holding the tea bags by their strings, one in each hand, as if taking them for a walk. I'll suggest renting one of those carpet cleaners, Gardenia thought, and I can show him how to use it. Not in my job description, but I'm betting that the facilities budget is for paper clips and copy paper and other dribs and drabs, not a new carpet. It's clear that Dr. Wiggins, whatever his relationship status may be, is no match for the requests of a young female professor who could easily be featured on a billboard for Iceland Air. And that's halfway through the first chapter. So thank you to Levi and to Jack Straw for the wonderful experience I've had recording the entire novel as an audiobook, and it's now available on Audible and at Libro.fm. Libraries can order it from Overdrive, and there are several other platforms, audiobook platforms that have it if you're interested. So you should be able to find it. The title of this talk is Preparing for National Novel Writing Month. And I wonder who among you are planning to participate in that? I assume some of you are. Maybe. As you know, the challenge of National Novel Writing Month is to create a complete draft of a novel in 1 month. 200 pages, I believe, is the goal. And the wonderful thing about this program is that it gets writers to, number one, finish a big messy draft, and two, to get into the habit of writing every day, theoretically, because if you're going to do 200 pages in a month, 30 days in the month, you're pretty much going to have to crank out, 7 pages a day at least, depending on how many days you work. So it helps you to establish your writing routine. It also gives you that wonderful satisfaction of finishing something. And so I wanted to share with anyone who's interested in doing NaNoWriMo, as it's called, some of what I learned from writing this novel. And I wish that someone had told me what I'm going to tell you before I had started writing, because it would have saved me a lot of time and stress. So I'm hoping that you will find some things that will expedite your experience as a National Novel Month writer. And I'm sure that there are no hard and fast rules for writing a novel. So what I'm saying is in no way prescriptive. It's just something that I would like to share as something I learned. So take it or leave it. And the way I'm going to present it, it's going to sound a bit prescriptive because I might say, do this or I did that, but please, that's just the syntactical way of doing it. I don't mean in any way to act like I have all the answers. I liken writing a novel to going on a trip, like maybe taking a trip, a month-long backpacking trip to Europe. And we know that there's one way to take a backpacking trip, whereas you just pack your backpack, get on a plane, land in London, and go. Perfectly decent way to do it, and people have great adventures that way. However, I think most of us would find that a bit stressful, and we might be afraid that we would miss something really cool, or that because of logistics, we would not be able to see something we really wanted to see. So most of us are going to get a Rick Steves guidebook or somebody else's guidebook and make some plans before we start. And then along the way, if we decide we really want to go to Barcelona rather than Sevilla, we'll do that. But we have a basic itinerary for how we're going to go. And that's what I would advise when you're embarking on writing a novel, to use some of these techniques I'm going to share to prepare. And then you're going to feel more confident as you start. And as you start to veer away perhaps from some of what you've outlined or chosen to prepare, you'll have something to circle back to as well, get back on your outline or get back to your characters and keep going. And I think what I most hope by following some of these steps is that you will finish a draft, because that is where we all get stuck. We get real excited at the beginning. We have the idea that we want for the first couple chapters, and then in the middle, we get bogged. We forget, we don't know where we're going. We don't know what's going on with our characters. And we kind of put it in the file cabinet and go off and do 13 other things, and there it might sit for a long time. So I'm going to grab my novel just a minute. This is it. It is in paperback. I should know this, but it's 224 pages. I think it was pretty close to 300 pages, maybe in manuscript form. As you know, when a manuscript goes into publication form, you lose some actual page count. I started this novel because I am a huge fan of the mid-20th century British writer Barbara Pym. And if you don't know Barbara Pym, please go out and read one of her books. The one I would suggest starting with is called Jane and Prudence, or the other one would be Crampton Hodnett, kind of a funny name. But she writes these wonderful novels set often in English villages or in north part of Oxford, kind of an academic community. And it's usually about some women who have what we would think to be sort of small concerns, like the jumble sale and the vicar coming to tea and all this. But basically, she writes with great perception about the human condition. She has a very wry sense of humor, and she has a great way of creating characters and their dialogue, great attention to detail. Those of us who love Barbara Pym often reread her novels several times. It's similar to people who love Jane Austen, because we just love them so much. And then when we don't have any more to read, we're just upset, like, what else am I going to read that's going to satisfy me as much? So I told myself, why don't you try to write a novel that's not going to be anywhere near what she can do, probably. I mean, I can't assume to be her genius, but maybe write something that is in her style, or that channels some of her sensibility. And I decided I was going to set it in Seattle, and I was not going to try to imitate or recreate her characters, but just try to kind of pick up on some of what she does. And one of the main things I wanted to do was to infuse the book with a bit of humor. And I find humor to be very hard to write, and I admire so much people who do it well. And I think there's a sense that if something is funny, that it must not be very hard to do because we're laughing. But actually, I think writing humor is pretty hard. So anyway, I started out. I decided also that I was going to work in some romantic plot lines into this novel, because it's a very easy way to create plot tension. It's a classic, romantic plot line is the couple going to get together thing. So I thought that would help move my story. And I started with a question. What would a mother do if she suspected that her daughter-in-law was cheating on her son? And if she dared to confront her daughter-in-law about this, Would she lose access to her grandchild and maybe even her grandson and even her son himself? So I chose as a protagonist a 56-year-old widow named Gardenia Pitkin. And I thought by making her a widow, I could automatically create complications in her life. The thing in a novel is a story. A story is about a character, a person that's going through some obstacles, problems, whatever, solves them, doesn't solve them, and comes out at the end somehow changed. That's the basic storyline of fairy tale, a novel, a saga, whatever. And so I thought if I made her a widow, I was automatically going to have more problems for her because being a widowhood is hard. And then I came up with the idea of setting it in an academic setting in an English department. I worked in academia for about 12 years, so I'm pretty familiar with all the things that go on in an academic department. And I've created as her co-protagonist, Arnold Wiggins, who you met in that section that I just read. And at first I thought I was going to tell the story just in the third person point of view of Gardenia Pitkin, but then I decided I wanted also to tell it from Arnold Wiggins' point of view. So I alternate in the book between the two points of view. And I have to say, I just loved writing from Arnold Wiggins' point of view, almost more than Gardenia's point of view. And I think he comes across, even though there's a gender difference there and many other differences, I'm much more like Gardenia, although I'm not a widow, but I really enjoyed writing from Arnold's point of view. And I think many writers would probably say that they love writing from the point of view of someone very different from themselves. I chose contemporary Seattle because I thought it would be much easier to do research on settings and also sensory research. And I didn't want to have to travel anywhere to do research. And I began by writing 500 words a day. This was many years ago. I really don't even want to think about how many years ago this was, but I had a day job at the time. So I'd get up in the morning and I'd write 500 words a day, sometimes more. And after a while, I had accumulated, much to my amazement, 300 manuscript pages. And fortunately, life intervened. I thought I was really hot stuff that I'd created 300 pages of manuscript. But fortunately, life intervened and I put it away. And then many months later, I pulled it out and read it. And I was like, oh, okay, this is not really very good. And so I worked on it some more. And then I hired an editor to go over it with me, and she gave me some feedback. And then I ran across this book by Elizabeth George, who's a mystery writer. You might know her from the Lindley Mysteries that you can see on BBC. And it's called Right Away. And she very much believes that writing a novel is something you can learn to do. And I'm going to just read a quote from her preface here. I've long believed that there are two distinct but equally important halves to the writing process. One of these is related to art. The other is related to craft. Obviously, art cannot be taught. No one can give another human being the soul of an artist, the sensibility of a writer, or the passion to put words on paper that is the gift and the curse of those who fashion poetry and prose. But it's ludicrous to suggest and short-sighted to believe that the fundamentals of fiction can't be taught. Craft is the point, not art, which, as I've said, cannot be taught, nor passion, which cannot be taught, nor discipline, which is essential, but which, alas, also cannot be taught. Pure craft will, of course, not make someone Shakespeare. It won't make someone William Faulkner or Jane Austen, but it can and will serve as a guide, as the soil in which a budding writer can plant the seed of her idea in order to nurture it into a story. A thorough knowledge of the tools of our trade is what gives us something to turn to when we run into difficulties. And this is what I was referring to earlier about getting bogged down in the middle of a drafting process. Without this knowledge, we are at the mercy of a muse who may turn fickle at the very moment when we're desperately depending upon her fidelity. Craft won't solve every problem a writer runs into during the creation of a piece, but it will eliminate a score of difficulties that the unschooled writer faces without it. So I started reading this book, and I highly recommend that you pick it up if you're going to launch into NaNoWriMo. She gives dozens of very practical ideas about how to create characters, how to do your research on settings. She gives tips on prose craft. It's so useful. And I wished so much that I had read this book before I started my first draft. So I went back to this 300-page manuscript and started working on it again. And the first thing I did was to create biographies for all my characters. And she believes in doing, it's a character analysis. I'm going to do a screen share here of, she has this list of prompts that she wants you to use to create your characters. And if any of you have ever been involved in the acting world, it's very much like what actors do. She wants name, age, height, weight. Can you see that? Can you see that? Full screen, can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, great. So these are the things that she wants you to consider as you write biographies for all of your characters. Name, age, height, weight, birthplace. And this is very much what actors do when they're trying to understand a character. They, even if these things are not given in the description of the character in the play, they try to imagine them to flesh out their understanding of the play. So I took every character in my story and I wrote a biography for them. And one thing that I think is very interesting about Elizabeth George's list here is this core need and pathological maneuver. This is very helpful in creating a storyline. If you know the core need of your character, you've got a motivation. And the pathological maneuver is sort of the weird thing that they do when they're under stress, when they're put against the wall. So that also creates some drama. So here's an example of one of the this is one of the biographies I wrote. This was for the Gardenia's son, Hans Pitkin. So, and I just sat down at the computer and I just typed whatever was coming to mind. I tried to get a visual image of who this character was. And then I just wrote. I didn't think too much about it. And it was really fun to see how this person started to come alive. And I show you, I really wrote a lot of pages about these characters. So if you see here, I have, this is, single spaced text for each of the characters, page after page, particularly the main characters, like Arnold Wiggins has a lot of text for his. And then another part of creating these characters is choosing names. And I always say that I feel very fortunate that I seem to have a naming angel who circles around my head and dumps names on me. So the names that I've come up with for these characters, Gardenia Pitkin, Arnold Wiggins, Frida Ham, Laurel Dubar, Lex Ohashi, Hamilton Dodge, are very unique names that I don't really even know where they came from, but they helped me so much to understand who the characters are. And now here's a little audience participation thing for you. I'm going to give you a list of names here. And I want you to think, please, if you could tell me, and I don't know quite how this will work, if you can unmute and just yell it out or what, but if you could give me an idea how old each of someone with this name, how old would they be? So Lloyd, for example, how old would Lloyd be?
Okay, 65.
65, okay, how about Jennifer?
She's 55.
She's 55?
Yeah.
Ashley?
Ashley's younger. She's 45.
Okay, Dorothy?
Dorothy's older. She's like Lloyd.
Okay, Susie?
Susie could be any age.
Mackenzie?
Who knows?
How about Doug?
Any age.
Anyone else have an idea? For Mackenzie or Doug or Madison?
I feel like Mackenzie is maybe 30.
Yeah, how about Doug?
I know a Doug, so actually I know a couple Dougs that are different ages. Maybe 50.
50, yeah. How about Madison?
30.
Pretty young.
Yeah. Teenager, maybe?
20 something, 30.
How about Elmer?
90.
He is dead.
Yeah, right. I was gonna say. How about Bill?
Any age.
And Myrtle?
Myrtle's old.
She's with
Yeah.
Elmer, yeah.
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 And Isabella?
Oh, she's young. 25.
Okay. So you can see that, my sense is that someone named Susie, that's more of a name maybe of my generation, sort of a 50s, I think. And I think Doug might be too. I mean, you find these names in all ages, but I think something like Mackenzie and Madison are much more trendy names, maybe of the last 15, 20 years. So they would be younger people. And Bill, interestingly, you don't really hear of many babies named Bill or little kids named Bill. Another one would be like Dylan. Dylan is a name sort of the more recent names. So the point here is when you're choosing names, if you have a 6-year-old boy in your story and it's a contemporary time frame and his name is Lloyd, there's a story there. Why is he named Lloyd? Because most people don't name their little boys Lloyd these days. Either that or maybe it's something regional. The same thing with Elmer. I don't think there are many little babies named Elmer these days. Now, if you had a woman of age 90 named Mackenzie, that would also imply a story of some sort because there's some reason that she would be named that because I think that's a much newer name. So the fun thing you can do when you know the age of your characters, you can go online and Google most popular babies' names 1951. And then you can do the math and go through the names and see if there's one that appeals to you that would be appropriate for the age of your character. Yeah, and writing these biographies, I cannot recommend highly enough. I think this was probably the most useful thing I got from Elizabeth George's book. Because as I went along writing, I felt so much that I knew who these people were. So I could imagine how they were going to talk, how they were going to interact with each other, what they were going to wear, what their complaints might be, what they were going to like. And they just really came alive to me through writing those biographies. And then the next thing I started to do was to build scenes. And to me, a novel is a collection of scenes, and scenes are settings with characters, doing something, interacting with other characters, experiencing something. And I had a little note on my bulletin board as I was writing that said, conflict is not optional. So conflict is what gives a novel wheels. If you just have two people talking, it gets very boring. If you want people to keep reading, they have to wonder what's going to happen next. And what causes that thought is some sort of conflict or problem between characters. And it could also be a conflict or problem with an outside force too, I suppose. But in my case, it was with characters. So I started out doing my outlining my chapters by telling where it was going to happen, the different scenes, the different locales that were going to occur in each chapter. And then I just went through and itemized what was going to happen, dunk, 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 almost as if you were, directing a stage play. She's going to walk there, then they're going to walk there, then this is going to happen, they're going to talk. I put down every single event that was going to happen in that chapter so that I was tracking the action. And then I went back and I made another chart that was, I call my conflict chart. And so I did the same thing where I put the date. This is also very important. I'll talk about this in a minute. I put the date that the action was occurring, and then a summary of what happens in that chapter. And then what are the conflicts? What were the conflicts that were happening in that chapter? And this is a way that I could check myself, kind of keep myself honest, and not just get lazy and have the characters, going to the store or mowing the lawn or musing about something. It kept me thinking about, okay, where is something happening that is going to make us sit up and take notice? And sometimes they were very seemingly small things, like we learn in the first chapter that I just read, that immediately Laurel Dubar wants Arnold Wiggins to clean the carpet. This is a conflict. This is a problem for him. And then later in the chapter, we see that Gardenia meets this guy, Lex Ohashi, and that immediately creates some tension in her, some conflict. What am I going to do about this man who's talking to me? And then in chapter 2, Arnold actually goes to the dean and asks for money to buy for carpet cleaning, or for a new carpet actually. And so there's some conflict there because the dean says no. And then he starts to bother Arnold Wiggins about not getting his book published, etc. So this helped guide me through the action, making sure that I had conflict. And the other thing that that Elizabeth George talks a lot about is setting detail. She actually sets all of her books in England, and she is American, and she actually lives in the Seattle area. She goes to England and she walks around and does research and collects things. And she warns people that if you are writing about your own hometown or your own block or your own neighborhood, you still have to do this, because there are lots of things that you just take for granted, you don't even see anymore, that could be really useful details in your setting, in creating setting. And so I went around to every locale that was in the book, and I took notes. And like I went to Pike Place Market, I walked around, I made notes. I went to the Century Ballroom where one of the scenes is set. I went to Pioneer Square. And at some point I realized I was going to set a scene in Arnold Wiggins' home, in his apartment. So I walked around Capitol Hill. I remember it was a really hot day, until I found what I thought was Arnold's apartment. And it was a 2-story house, older house on 14th Avenue. And it was divided into 2 apartments. I could see there was a bottom apartment, and then there was an upstairs apartment that had a deck. And so that became Arnold Wiggins' apartment in my mind. And it happened to be right across the alley from a small Russian Orthodox church. So that was a great little detail that I could work in, that he would be sitting on his deck looking at these onion domes across the alley. And a very interesting little sideline that I'll share is that some reader of a man I don't know found my book and read it and got in touch with me and said that he liked it. And he thought that he'd lived in Seattle a long time, and he thought that the Seattle settings were very seamless. And I thought, well, that's great, thank you. And then he said, oh, and by the way, I used to live down the street from Arnold Wiggins, which I thought was very amusing. I mean, obviously had found the house, and it was almost as if, Arnold Wiggins was real. So I decided in creating the arc of the action to choose a very short time span. I made it from the last part of March until the early part of June. And this was kind of easy to do because I was in an academic setting, so I could make it just 1 quarter. And I highly recommend, if you are writing your first novel, as I was, well, actually I'd written a couple others, but for, really seriously writing one, to keep the time frame tight. I recently talked to a writer who had just drafted a complete novel. I thought that was terrific. And I asked him, it was about how long was the the action. And he said it was like 4 years or something. And when he told me the gist of the story, I realized that this was going to be, I doubted that he had pulled it off. I hadn't read it, but I kind of doubted that he'd pulled it off. Because if you're going to have a really long time span, you have to account for everything that happens in that 1 or 2 year time period. Whether you do it directly or implied, there has to be, no one lives through a year of time and not having some change in their life. So if you have a character that's living, a bunch of characters that are living for a whole year from the time you started, or 2 years, there's going to be all kinds of changes in their lives, and you're going to have to account for that somehow. Too complicated for me. So I made my time frame about 2.5 months, and I think, we can, all of us, go at some point after we've learned some basic craft skills, we can all go write the big saga, which many writers do, and they're wonderful to read. But to start out, I think you really do yourself a favor if you keep it pretty tight. And so the other thing I did to chart my action was, I actually took a paper calendar that I wasn't using, and I blocked out, as you can see, when every day that the action was happening. And the reason I did this was so that I could make sure that if something was happening on a Saturday and then something else had to happen on a Wednesday, that it all tracked correctly. So every scene in the book is associated with a specific date on a calendar. Now, this was, I thought, very clever. This is actually not something I got from Elizabeth George. I kind of came upon this on my own, but it really worked for me. However, as I was revising, some scenes were dropped, some things were rearranged. And so then I had to go back and replot everything on a calendar again. But I did it. It was what I really believed in doing. But I highly recommend this too, as a way to keep yourself from getting too confused about when things are happening, and also to keep what I call veracity in fiction. To me, it is very important to have everything in a work of fiction, accurate. And people will say to me, yeah, but it's just a story. Well, yes, it is. But within the fictional world you have created, or I have created, I want everything to be absolutely true and real. So in other words, I didn't, in the middle of my book set in Seattle, suddenly have a streetcar running down the middle of Broadway. I mean, I don't know why I might have done that, but that would have been wrong, and it would have bothered somebody. And it wasn't correct anyway. Now, if you think about someone who writes science fiction, that writer is creating a whole world with all kinds of details and structures and a kind of its own logic. And people who read science fiction demand that once that world is created, that everything stays that way, that the author doesn't suddenly bring in an ice cream truck onto Mars or something. And so if you use that as an example, I think even when you're writing in contemporary times in a real setting, the same thing applies. So that's one of the reasons that I went around and did all the locale research. And the other thing I did was, during that 2.5 months time between March and June, I went around, and on that calendar, I noted everything that was blooming at that time, what days things were blooming, so that I didn't get like the tulips and the, well, I guess, what is the last thing to bloom? I guess, you'll have the jonquils, and then the azaleas come much later, kind of thing. So, and I have lots of botanical references in the book, so I wanted those to be very accurate. Another fun thing that I did that I don't think Elizabeth George suggested, but it worked for me, was I sat down with an actual copy of a Barbara Pym novel and a legal pad and a pen. And in the morning before I'd start to write, I would often just copy exactly what was on her page there, just copy verbatim what she had written. And I wasn't trying to plagiarize, of course, but I wanted to just like absorb in my cells her way of writing, her style. And it was such a great way to get started. It kind of warmed me up. It made me feel happy to have her words in my head. And I think if there's a writer that you admire and you're maybe even trying to emulate somehow, that's just a fine thing to do. And I don't, you know, visual artists are often taken into art galleries and told to copy a master, just to kind of learn the techniques or to see what they're doing. And that's considered like a very, very good learning technique. And I think this copying passages from a book that you admire is similar and very defensible and very useful. When I had gone over the final draft of Gardenia, and actually, interestingly, her name started out in my very first draft as Priscilla, and then I decided that was a little too prissy sounding, so I changed it to Gardenia. And people say, why do you call it Gardenia? I don't really know, but I think when the name came to me, I liked it because it was unusual, and also because it had a botanical flavor to it. And I have lots of horticultural references in the book, so that kind of all fit. After I'd done this draft and had gone over it a few times, I went online and I found an editor from the Northwest Editors Guild and hired her to go over the book, to go over the manuscript for me. I met her in person. She lived in Seattle, and I gave her the manuscript and I said, would you please just sit down? I'm going to pay you. Just sit down and read this without your editor's pen in your hand. Just read it. See if it keeps your attention, if there's anything you like, there's anything that slows you down, whatever. And then let me know if it looks like a project you'd like to work on. So she did that. She liked it and then went on to do a much tougher edit. A good editor is a saint, and I urge you to go ahead and spend some pretty good money on a professional editor rather than asking your cousin who got an English degree to do your editing for you. I mean, that person may be very good, but there's something very wonderful about having someone who doesn't really know you, who doesn't care if they hurt your feelings, who doesn't care if they say something you don't like. And I think when we look to our friends, relatives, neighbors, cousins, whatever, to give us feedback on a book, it's really hard for them to be honest. And they may not have the skills to really tell you where and how to make improvements. It takes a professional, I believe, to do that. So that's basically how the novel came to be. And if you like, during Q&A, we could talk a little bit about my publishing process. I don't know if you're interested in that. It seems like, right, if you're doing NaNoWriMo, your main concern is to get that draft done. And that's what I hope maybe some of these tips might enable you to do. But I do want to share a couple general thoughts I have about writing and writing a novel in particular. I decided I was going to write the novel that I want to read. I don't know what anybody else wants to read. I don't know if what's trending now is what I could write, what will still be trending by the time my book might be in print. So I decided the only person that I really know, whose opinion I really know, is mine. So I'm going to write the book that I want to read. And when I'm writing something, no matter what it is, I speak only in generalities about it, like, oh, I'm writing a play. Oh, I'm writing a novel set in Seattle. Oh, I just wrote a short story set on the day that I was born. Just in very general terms. And if people want more details, they're not going to get them. Two reasons for this. One, if I start to blah, 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 all the details of what I'm writing, suddenly I don't need to write it anymore. I've already dispelled my need to tell the story. And I don't want to do that. The second reason is, as we all know, you're telling someone your ideas and you can see on their face, do they think it's a good idea or not? And so immediately it affects your self-confidence. You're like, ooh, he didn't act like he thought that was a very good idea. Or they might lob in some ideas of their own, which may be helpful, but maybe not at all at that point in your process. So sometimes people that I know are a little bit, they don't quite get that. Why don't they can't ask me more about what I'm doing, but I really stick firmly to that rule that I don't talk about what I'm doing until I have a complete thing done. And then I might say in slightly more detail what it is. And the other thing where I am quite an outlier in the world of writers is that I don't do a writers group. I have done a couple in the past, and I decided that they're not helpful for me, and they can't even be harmful. They are such a thing. Writers workshops, I mean, there are whole master's degrees built around writers workshops. And for some people, they seem to work great. My sense is that a fiction writer who has a long work that they're dealing with cannot give the first 2 chapters to anyone in a writer's workshop and really get anything useful, unless perhaps they've written the whole thing and they're ready to see, they know in their own mind what, because they've written it, they know what's going to happen and how it's going to end and all this. But if you give someone the first 2 chapters of your novel before you've even finished it, how can they help you? Because you don't even know yourself exactly how it's going to end, what you might need to do with it, what your questions are. And again, it's like telling about your story before you've written it down. It kind of could get you really confused, could destroy your confidence. And also, unfortunately, in lots of writers groups, I think some of those unpleasant human qualities of competition and kind of envy get into play. And so sometimes people can be a little mean and too critical. So I don't do writers workshops. And I like to always tell that to people in case maybe they're feeling like they don't want to do them either. There's at least one other person who doesn't do them. A few other prose craft points that I learned along the way, which again, I want to share because I want to save you time and help you. And that is, which many of you probably already know, is that when you're doing dialogue, you use said almost all the time. You don't attribute it with an adverb. The words themselves and the context should give the reader some idea of the feeling of the person speaking. So you don't want to say, he said huskily, she cackled sharply. And some genres, I think maybe in like mystery genres or maybe even romance. I don't read romance, but I think there are genres where that's more tolerated. The readers don't mind that. But mainstream fiction, really, you want to stay away from those. And maybe now and then you can use an adverb attribution, but you don't get too many. Like maybe in a whole book you get 4 or something like that. And also you want to stick to said. You might be able to say asked now and then, but you don't want to necessarily use different verbs like, she murmured, she chattered, he bellowed. Again, you can use those a few times, but they become very distracting, and you need to focus instead on the content of the dialogue to purvey those feelings. And the other thing that I learned kind of late in the game was filter words. We tend to write things like, he walked out of the house and saw the blue sky. He smelled the lilacs in the air. He heard a bird chirp. So all of those, he felt, he said, he smelled, all those are, he heard, those are called filter words. And what we really want is, it creates a bit of a barrier between the prose and the reader's sensation of it. So instead, you want to say, he walked out of the house, the sky was blue, the lilac fragrance infused the backyard, a bird clamored in the tree, something like that, so that you're we know that he's sensing all these things, that the character is sensing these things, but you're not putting that he, the felt, heard, saw to start off the sentence. Another thing I learned from a middle grade fiction writer was to describe in action. So for example, here's an example I just made up. Here's where we're describing the way a character looks. He wore a red cardigan, a green bow tie, and a yellow bowler hat. So we're describing what he's wearing. But a better way to do that is to get some action involved. So you would say, he set his yellow bowler hat on the ground to summon tips and straightened his green bow tie. His red cardigan was missing 2 buttons. So there's there's something going on besides just listing. And, you know, you can, I think you might not have noticed, but in one of the earlier lines in that part that I read to you, I say something about Arnold Wiggins raked his graying auburn curls. Well, I could have said in an earlier description, he had graying auburn curls, but instead I put some action into it to get the same detail added, but not just to list it. Okay, so those are some tips I have, some very specific tips, and we'll open it up to Q&A. But before I start doing that, I want to just read some of my favorite quotes about writing. I'm sure you writers all have some of these things posted up on your walls or your bulletin boards. Okay, here's one. This is one of my favorite ones. The whole duty of a writer is to please and satisfy himself, and the true writer always plays to an audience of one. Let him start sniffing the air or glancing at the trend machine, and he is as good as dead, although he may make a nice living. This is E.B. White, who wrote Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little, many essays for the New Yorker. And this is one from Barbara Pym. So I try to write what pleases and amuses me and hope that a few others will like it too. And this is from Jane Austen. No, I must keep to my own style and go in my own way. And though I may never succeed again in that, I am convinced that I should totally fail in any other. And this, all three of those quotes speak to my conviction that I'm writing a book that I want to read, not worrying at all about what someone else might like. And here's one also from Jane Austen. Let other pens dwell on guilt and misery. I quit such odious subjects as soon as I can. That's Jane Austen. Anthony Trollope, there's no way of writing well and also of writing easily, which anyone who's tried to write a novel will certainly agree with that. And so those are some, oh, and the other one that I have right in front of my, by my keyboard is, the muse prizes labor and dedication above all. Just keep doing the work.